Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be here, my first visit to Ankara. I would like to thank the Lahore Center for Peace Research and the Institute of Strategic Thinking very much indeed for inviting me for Kashmir in Turmoil, Kashmir Krisi. I'm glad that we have had the permission to talk about current events, because whatever happened yesterday, as far as I'm concerned, is history. And I'd like to start my presentation by reading from a blog that was posted by a friend of mine. She couldn't put her name for obviously security reasons, but she's a Kashmiri woman who lives in Srinagar. And she posted this soon after the events of August 5th. So how are you feeling about all this? Asked a friend about the abrogation of Article 370 and the unprecedented security lockdown in Kashmir by the Indian government on August 5th, 2019. I could not come up with a coherent answer. I had spent 2 days in an ATM queue in order to get enough cash to buy air tickets to fly out of Kashmir with my kids. Debit and credit cards don't work because the network has been shut down, followed by half a day of waiting at the airport because of flight delays. No phones work, so you can't call the airport to check your flight status. And this was a relatively good day. The previous 5 days, we weren't allowed to move out of our house by armed Indian paramilitary men. I couldn't get medicine for my 4-year-old who had a chest infection. Supplies were running out, and from day 3 on, we had no electricity. Most of my friends and neighbors, activists, trade union leaders, and mainstream politicians had been arrested, and since the jails in Kashmir were all full, more than 70 had been sent to a prison in Agra, India. No contact with the outside world. It was basically a prison sentence without the pronouncement. How does one describe such a catastrophic chain of events adequately and objectively, especially if one is caught up in it? All I could say at the time was that it was a Holocaust by other means, a state-led attempt at the erasure of an identity, a body of rights and citizenship, the attempted erasure of a community's place in the world. People who don't know much about Kashmir wonder what warranted this sudden and unilateral revocation of a constitutional provision that has allowed the people of Jammu and Kashmir to have their own constitution, flag, and the right to define its own citizenship with rights and privileges for nearly 70 years. The answer is the Bharatiya Janata Party's majoritarian agenda of homogenizing India after the pattern of an idealized Hindu past. Coming to power with a huge majority in the national elections in May 2019 has meant for the BJP the overt execution of its covert Hindutva anti-minority agenda. The Indian Muslim, who had hitherto been othered and lynched with chilling regularity by Hindu extremists across the northern states, is now facing a state-led assault on her rights and citizenship. The abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir and the National Register of Citizens that is externing hundreds of Assamese Muslims as illegal immigrants are two sides of the same coin. But because Kashmir is a potential nuclear flashpoint, it gets the international attention that Assam does not, which is why, after having their rights taken away, the citizens of Jammu and Kashmir were cut off from the rest of the world by the longest, most comprehensive communications blackout by a democratic regime in the history of the modern world. The Indian government basically enforced a brutal invisibilization of Kashmiri expression after it dismembered the Kashmiris' legal right to exist by their own definition. It was insult and injury heaped on too close together to be distinguishable. This, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, is what my friend sent me from Srinagar. And I think it's important also to hear that voice of how people are suffering. For you, the international community, I urge you, if you want to help the people of Kashmir, it's important to focus on 3 things. We have talked about them this morning, but it's relevant also for our session on history. And the first issue is really to be informed. and this is where the history comes in, to understand the dispute. I've been coming and going to South Asia, India and Pakistan for over 40 years. My first visit to Pakistan was in 1978. My first visit to India was in 1981, and that's when I first went to the Valley of Kashmir and became appraised of the dispute. And that's why I have written a book which I called Kashmir in the Crossfire. It was first published in 1996. It's now going into its 5th edition. And I really do urge you to understand the issue in all its complexities. People think they understand about Jammu and Kashmir. They talk only with reference with what is going on in the valley, but they fail to mention that the state, like a huge butterfly straddling the Himalayan mountains, also includes Ladakh, Jammu, Gilgit-Baltistan, and that narrow strip of land which in Pakistan is known as Azad Jammu and Kashmir, focused on the regions of Mirpur, Poonch, Muzaffarabad, and the Neelam Valley, which incidentally the Indian government has now included in its new map as all being part of Jammu and Kashmir Union Territory, having also included Gilgit-Baltistan as part of Ladakh as another Union Territory. Different languages are spoken, different religions followed, and people in the various regions have different aspirations. It's a complex issue, as we know, which has defied resolution for over 70 years. So if you want to lobby heads of government, you need to understand the issue in its entirety, which is why the Indian government's unilateral revoking of Article 370 cannot be looked at in isolation. In the current crisis, as illustrated by the article I just read, you need to understand what precisely the loss of the state's special status enshrined in the Indian constitution means for the people. Why did Jammu and Kashmir get special status? You heard in our moderator's introductory remarks about the accession of Jammu and Kashmir in 1947. What did that special status mean? Why has the current BJP government of Narendra Modi been so intent on revoking it? Why, if it was supposed to be a measure to benefit the inhabitants, did the government of India feel it so necessary to put the valley on lockdown, cut off all communications, close schools, and bring in yet more troops to militarize the state? What is the legal position? Can the issue be taken to the International Court of Justice? We also need to see through Prime Minister Modi's statement that the action was taken to benefit the Kashmiris so they could progress along the same lines as India. If you read the statistics produced by the Indian government, which show that the state is ahead of the rest of the country in most human development indicators, I will cite a few. In terms of education, where the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir started far behind the rest of the country, it does better than the national average in literacy figures for men, 89%, and women, 69%, against the national figures of 85.7% and 68.4% respectively. It has one of the lowest levels of poverty in India. It also has the highest percentage of people who have their own houses, and life expectancy at birth in Jammu and Kashmir is higher again than a national average. I'm afraid the development argument is the oldest colonial argument in the book. It's, never mind about freedom and your rights, but we'll develop you. Secondly, in relation to the current crisis, and we have heard about it also this morning, it is important to adopt a humanitarian approach and to look at the issue in humanitarian terms. This is a humanitarian issue affecting the lives of 8+ million people living across the line of control in the Valley of Kashmir. Therefore, it's important, especially when lobbying international community, to talk about this humanitarian aspect. It's not a chunk of territory. It's not a territorial dispute between India and Pakistan. It is, as we've heard, and Sherry Rahman mentioned it this morning, it's about the rights of individuals. Even before the latest events, I was in the Valley of Kashmir in May. Young students told me how difficult it was to keep up their studies because they never knew when their schools were going to be closed, their exams postponed. Teachers had the same problem. They were trying to inspire children to study, but they couldn't get through the curriculum because the schools were shut, and then they had to try and eat into the holidays and persuade children to study during their holidays, and we all know how difficult it is to inspire children. Their children are like your children. They want to live. They want to get jobs, see their friends, get married. They want to take pride in what they're doing and what they're learning. They want to be able to ride a motorbike around the beautiful Dal Lake without fear of being picked up by the military and being charged with being a militant. The stress and trauma on young minds is immeasurable. Living in a conflict zone for the past 30 years has brought so much suffering. This is what you have to highlight, and how, with now even greater control from New Delhi, the loss of that last vestige of its special status, Article 370 and Article 35A, the lives of Kashmiris are going to be even more circumscribed, not to mention the potential for a change in demographics. It was truly heartbreaking to see that flag of Jammu and Kashmir being taken down. The third point, it's imperative, and again, we've heard this already this morning, to lobby for dialogue. Nothing is going to be served by not talking, at whatever level. And here again, it's a question of ensuring that the international community understands what's at stake. Regardless of what India might like to claim, the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir is a disputed territory, proof of which is obvious. Otherwise, why would India be claiming that the whole state of Jammu and Kashmir is part of India, as indicated on any map produced or sponsored by India? I often look at the moving map on aeroplanes, and if you take the time to look at the moving map, the whole state is always demarcated as being part of India. And I think this territorial issue in terms of the dispute is separate from the human rights situation in the valley, but it's part and parcel of what's going on. And I do agree with the previous speakers that it's absolute nonsense to talk about this as being a bilateral issue. This is a narrative which the Indian government has managed to develop post-1972 Shimla Agreement. But any issue which affects all humankind, as this clearly does, by definition, is of international concern. It was our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, who said that an issue involving human rights is of international concern. So, in my opinion, there is no other way forward than dialogue between India and Pakistan. India may say it's not ready, but delay is a luxury it cannot afford. And if Pakistan has to go the long-winded way around by pressurizing the international community to pressurize India to talk, then that may be what has to happen. And Turkey may be an ideal facilitator, moderator, interlocutor. If, as we know, India wants to have a permanent, a seat as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, then it cannot reject criticism and comment from those with whom it wants to sit. President Trump has now downgraded his offer to mediate, but that doesn't mean that he cannot be pressured to put pressure on India to have a dialogue with Pakistan. And as we know, talking about a bilateral issue and not talking about a bilateral issue for 72 years clearly hasn't worked. It's a little bit like a couple who wants to divorce, but they don't want to use a lawyer. And finally, the children say, you know, get a life, get a lawyer, get a mediator if you can't agree how to divorce. And this is effectively what we're trying to do with the situation over Jammu and Kashmir. President Macron of France may have already given his support to India's membership of the United Nations Security Council. This provides an ideal opportunity to emphasize to President Macron the importance of resolving the dispute over Jammu and Kashmir as a prerequisite to lending his support. So, honorable guests, distinguished delegates, as many of you know, I have a great affection for South Asia. I have traveled in so many regions. I've been the length and breadth of Jammu and Kashmir on both sides. I've been very fortunate, and I care deeply about the region and peace and stability. All people living in that region have the right, as we do, to freedom of movement, freedom of expression, rule of law, and ability to have a visa, to come to conferences. There's no one from the Valley here today. So I urge you, learn your history. It's difficult to parachute into an issue just from one date. You can parachute in 1947-48. You can parachute back to 1846 to understand why. Why did the British sell the Valley of Kashmir in the Treaty of Amritsar? It's with that understanding that you can hope to build some foundation for dialogue. What about 1931? What about the beginning of the independence movement against the autocracy of the Maharaja, the Abdul Qadir incident? What about 1965? What about the rigged elections in 1987, which started the insurgency? This all needs to be known. Otherwise, you are victim to the rhetoric from India that it was all inspired by Pakistan. India has managed to turn an amazing blind eye to what's actually going on in the valley because everything is Pakistan's fault. Everything is cross-border terrorism. Having just been in the valley, as I mentioned, I can tell you it's not just about cross-border terrorism. Even one of their excuses was that the spirit of separatism has been fostered by Article 370, and hence that's why they had to get rid of it. But without that knowledge, you have half knowledge, and I'm afraid half knowledge isn't good enough, because then it can very easily get counteracted. So I really think of your students at universities, learn about the Kashmir issue, really understand it's the Jammu Kashmir issue. It involves the valley, but it involves the whole state. This is what I set myself the task to do over 30 years ago so that I could really speak informatively about the issue, because if one isn't informed, one's knowledge is useless. Thank you very much.